The stars looked different here, near the edge of human space, where the UEC, Defiance, drifted slowly toward the massive alien fleet that waited like sleeping giants in the void. Jake Morrison pressed his face against the small window in the observation deck and watched the Calaxian ships grow larger with each passing hour. Each vessel looked alive somehow, with curves and flowing lines that reminded him more of sea creatures than the sharp angles of human warships. Morrison had seen many strange things during his 10 years in the Colonial Marines, but nothing quite like this. The Calaxian ships seemed to pulse with their own light, and he could swear he saw them moving in ways that defied the basic laws of physics he remembered from academy training. Some of the crew whispered that the alien vessels were actually living beings rather than built machines, but Jake tried not to think about that too much. Colonel Danny Brooks called the diplomatic team to the briefing room, where holographic displays showed detailed scans of the alien fleet. The Calaxians had agreed to this meeting after months of careful communication through radio signals and mathematical equations. Humanity needed all eyes badly, because reports from the outer colonies spoke of something terrible approaching from the dark space between galaxies. The Vorthic Empire had already consumed 17 star systems, according to the refugees who managed to escape their advance. Every world they touched became a dead industrial complex that pumped out more ships and weapons for their endless hunger. Human forces had tried to fight them twice and lost both battles completely. The survivors described enemies that felt no fear and showed no mercy in their systematic destruction of everything they encountered. Brooks explained the mission parameters to the small diplomatic team that would transfer to the Calaxian flagship for negotiations. Jake wondered why they had chosen him for this assignment, since his specialty was ground combat rather than diplomacy. His record showed a pattern of unconventional tactics that often broke standard military protocol, but somehow achieved impossible victories against superior forces. The transfer shuttle felt tiny as it approached the alien mothership that stretched for miles in every direction. Jake counted weapon systems that could probably destroy the entire human fleet with ease, yet the Calaxians had agreed to talk rather than simply eliminate what they might see as inferior beings. The shuttle bay that received them looked organic, with walls that seemed to breathe and lights that shifted color as they passed underneath. Calaxian escort troops waited for them inside the bay, and Jake got his first close look at humanity's potential allies. They stood nearly 7 feet tall with humanoid shapes covered in what looked like living crystal armor that changed from deep blue to silver as they moved. Their faces showed intelligence and pride in equal measure, with eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they observed with the attention of natural predators. The escort led the human delegation through corridors that curved and twisted in patterns that made no sense according to human ship design. Jake noticed that the walls seemed to respond to the presence of the Calaxians with subtle changes in color and texture. He began to understand that this was not just a ship, but some kind of living organism that had been shaped into a weapon of war. They entered a vast chamber where Princess Zarathi Velinara held court surrounded by her military advisors and fleet commanders. She sat on what might have been a throne, except that it seemed to be part of the ship itself, with tendrils of light connecting her armor to the walls around them. Her presence filled the room with authority that came from countless victories and the absolute confidence of someone who had never known defeat. The negotiations began with formal ceremonies that Jake found difficult to follow, but Colonel Brooks seemed to understand the importance of following proper protocol. The humans presented their offer of alliance against the Vorthic threat, while the Calaxians listened with expressions that revealed nothing of their thoughts. Princess Zarathi asked detailed questions about human military capabilities and tactical doctrines that Brooks answered as honestly as possible. Jake watched the alien princess carefully and began to notice patterns in how she moved and spoke that reminded him of the great predators he had studied during survival training. Every gesture served a purpose, and every word carried weight that went beyond simple meaning. Her armor shifted through different colors as the conversation progressed, and he wondered if this represented some kind of emotional display that humans were not supposed to understand. The turning point came when Princess Zarathi ordered a demonstration of Calaxian combat techniques in the ship's training arena. Her warriors moved with fluid grace that seemed to blend martial arts with some kind of energy, manipulation that allowed them to fight at ranges and speeds that human soldiers could never match. Their weapons appeared to be extensions of their armor rather than separate tools, and they flowed from offense to defense with seamless precision. Colonel Brooks praised the display with appropriate diplomatic language, but Jake found himself analyzing the techniques from a tactical perspective. He saw weaknesses in their formations that could be exploited by unconventional attacks and recognized patterns that suggested they had never faced an enemy that refused to follow traditional rules of engagement. The Vorthik would not be impressed by elegant combat forms or honor-based challenges. When Princess Zarathi asked for human opinions on what they had witnessed, Jake stepped forward before Brooks could respond. He began to explain how the Calaxian techniques could be modified to handle enemies that attacked without warning or honor, while using the environment as a weapon rather than simply meeting force with force. His suggestions contradicted thousands of years of Calaxian military tradition and touched on concepts that their culture considered dishonorable. The princess rose from her throne with armor that shifted to deep crimson as anger radiated from her presence like heat from a forge. Her voice carried the authority of absolute command when she spoke, and every Calaxian in the room stood straighter in automatic response to her displeasure. "You're not worthy, human," she spat with contempt that cut deeper than any physical weapon could have managed. "Your species crawls through space in metal shells, while we soar with living ships. You know nothing of true warfare or the honor that separates civilization from chaos." Colonel Brooks tried to salvage the situation with apologies and explanations, but Princess Zarathi had already dismissed the human delegation from her presence. The escort troops surrounded them with expressions that suggested any further conversation would not be welcome, and the diplomatic mission ended in complete failure. As their shuttle returned to the UEC Defiance, Jake watched the Calaxian fleet begin to move away from human space, with the knowledge that humanity would face the approaching Vorthik invasion alone. 3 weeks passed like a countdown to execution as reports flooded in from scout ships at the edge of human territory. The Vorthik Empire had begun their assault with surgical precision that targeted both human and Calaxian worlds simultaneously. Jake Morrison stood in the command bunker on New Haven Colony, watching holographic displays that showed the enemy advance like a spreading infection across the star maps. New Haven was supposed to be a safe world far from the frontier where families could build new lives without worrying about alien invasions or military conflicts. The colony housed nearly 2 million civilians who had never seen combat and depended entirely on a small garrison of colonial marines for protection. Jake commanded 300 soldiers against what intelligence reports suggested would be a force of at least 3,000 Vorthik warriors supported by their biomechanical war machines. The enemy ships appeared in the outer system without warning, as if they had materialized from empty space itself. Vorthik vessels looked like twisted combinations of living tissue and industrial machinery that moved with purpose. They felt both organic and artificial. Their hulls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that reminded Jake of deep-sea creatures, except these monsters brought death instead of wonder. Colonel Brooks had been reassigned to Fleet Command after the failed diplomatic mission which left Jake as the senior officer on New Haven when the invasion began. His first decision was to evacuate as many civilians as possible while preparing defensive positions that could delay the enemy advance long enough for the evacuation ships to escape. The mathematics were simple and terrible, since they had transport capacity for maybe half the population, even if everything went perfectly. Lisa Rodriguez worked frantically in the communications center, trying to coordinate with other human worlds that faced similar attacks. Her reports painted a picture of systematic destruction as the Vorthik overwhelmed colony after colony with tactics that seemed designed to maximize terror rather than simply achieve military objectives. They converted captured facilities into production centers that immediately began manufacturing more weapons and soldiers for their expanding war machine. The first Vorthik landing craft touched down in the agricultural zones outside the main settlement, where automated defense systems managed to destroy several attackers before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Jake watched through surveillance drones as enemy soldiers emerged from their transports with movements that seemed coordinated by some invisible intelligence that connected them all into a single fighting organism. Each Vorthik warrior stood, roughly 8 feet tall, with 4 arms that ended in weapon systems rather than hands. Their bodies showed clear signs of biological modification, with armor plates that had grown rather than been manufactured, and sensory organs that tracked multiple targets simultaneously. They moved without the individual personalities that Jake was used to seeing in human or even alien soldiers, but instead functioned as extensions of some greater collective mind. Jake had studied every available report about Vorthik tactics during the 3 weeks since the diplomatic failure and noticed patterns that suggested both strengths and potential weaknesses in their approach. The hive mind that controlled them provided perfect coordination, but also created dependencies that could be exploited by someone willing to think beyond traditional military doctrine. His first trap was set in the industrial district, where he had positioned his Marines in positions that appeared to be standard defensive formations. When the Vorthik attacked, they followed predictable patterns that allowed Jake to channel them into a warehouse complex that had been rigged with improvised explosives and environmental hazards. The enemy coordination worked against them when the collapse of one building triggered a chain reaction that destroyed their entire assault formation. The success was temporary, since more Vorthik forces kept landing, while Jake's ammunition and supplies dwindled with each engagement. He began using psychological warfare tactics that exploited the collective nature of their intelligence by creating false signals that confused their coordination systems. Captured Vorthik communication equipment allowed Lisa Rodriguez to inject misleading data into their network, which caused several units to attack each other by mistake. Meanwhile, in distant space, Princess Zarathi faced her own crisis as Vorthik bioviruses corrupted 3 of her living warships during what should have been a routine patrol mission. The infection spread through the organic systems of her fleet, like a disease that turned the ships themselves into weapons aimed at their former crews. Traditional Calaxian honor combat proved useless against an enemy that corrupted rather than simply destroyed everything it encountered. Her flagship trembled as infected vessels opened fire with weapons that had once protected Calaxian space. Zarathi watched her tactical displays with growing horror as she realized that the enemy had studied their technology and developed specific counters for every advantage the Calaxians had believed gave them superiority over lesser species. The biomechanical nature of her ships, that had been their greatest strength, became a vulnerability that the Vorthik exploited with ruthless efficiency. Commander Kefmer reported that similar infections were spreading throughout the Calaxian fleet as ships that had served for centuries suddenly turned against their crews. The living vessels screamed in frequencies that Calaxian ears could detect as they died, and were reborn as weapons in service to an alien intelligence that viewed them as nothing more than useful components in a larger machine. Back on New Haven, Jake led increasingly desperate raids against Vorthik positions, using tactics that his academy instructors would have called insane. He sent small teams to sabotage enemy equipment while using civilian infrastructure as weapons against the invaders. Power plants became improvised bombs, while water treatment facilities were converted into chemical weapon dispensers that targeted the specific biology of Vorthic warriors. The breakthrough came when Jake realized that the hive mind controlling the enemy required constant communication to maintain coordination between different units. He began targeting their communication nodes with precision strikes that created gaps in their network coverage. Without central coordination, individual Vorthic soldiers became confused and vulnerable to attacks they could not anticipate or counter effectively. Lisa Rodriguez managed to establish contact with the Calaxian fleet during a brief lull in the Yao, fighting when both forces found themselves struggling against the same enemy. Her communication systems picked up Calaxian distress signals that painted a picture of defeat and desperation that matched their own situation on New Haven. The proud warrior race was learning that honor and tradition meant nothing against an enemy that fought without rules or mercy. When Princess Zarathi saw surveillance footage of Jake's impossible defense of New Haven, her armor shifted to deep blue, which her advisors recognized as the color of grudging respect. The human tactics were everything she had condemned as dishonorable. Yet they were achieving results that traditional Calaxian warfare could not match against this particular enemy. Her pride prevented her from requesting assistance, but she found herself studying the human approach with new interest. Jake had managed to hold the Yao Vorthic advance for 6 days, using improvised weapons and unconventional strategies that turned every civilian building into a potential weapon against the invaders. His forces were reduced to less than 50 effective soldiers, while enemy reinforcements continued to arrive from space, but somehow they had prevented the complete conquest of New Haven long enough for most of the civilian population to escape. The cost of victory was measured in the exhausted faces of his Marines and the ruins of what had once been a peaceful colony. Jake knew they could not hold much longer against an enemy that seemed to have unlimited resources and perfect coordination. Yet the defense of New Haven had proven that humans could fight the Vorthic Empire and win if they were willing to abandon traditional concepts of honorable warfare and embrace the chaos of total conflict. The news reached Jake Morrison 3 days after the evacuation of New Haven, when Admiral Ryan Carter summoned him to the command ship for what he assumed would be a debriefing about the colonial defense. Instead, he found himself looking at classified intelligence reports that described a Calaxian disaster that had occurred while he was fighting for his life on the planet below. Princess Zarathi had been captured during a Vorthic boarding action on her flagship and was now held prisoner in one of their processing stations deep in enemy territory. Admiral Carter explained the situation with the clinical detachment of someone who dealt with strategic losses on a daily basis. The Calaxians had written off their princess as dead, according to their military code that considered captured warriors to be lost beyond recovery. Their culture simply had no concept of rescue missions, since honor demanded that soldiers die fighting rather than allow themselves to be taken alive by enemies. Jake studied the intelligence data that showed the massive Vorthic processing station, where Princess Zarathi was being held along with thousands of other prisoners from dozens of different species. The facility served as both a prison and a factory where the enemy extracted useful information from captured individuals before converting them into components for their war machine. Most prisoners survived less than a week before their minds were broken down and rebuilt to serve Vorthic purposes. The strategic value of rescuing the Calaxian princess was obvious, since her tactical knowledge could provide the enemy with detailed information about remaining Calaxian defenses and ship capabilities. More importantly, her capture represented a psychological victory that would demoralize Calaxian forces throughout the war zone. Yet Admiral Carter made it clear that no official rescue mission would be authorized, since it would require resources that humanity could not afford to lose. Jake requested permission to study the intelligence files more carefully and spent the next 18 hours analyzing every detail of the processing station's defenses and internal structure. The facility was protected by layers of automated systems and mobile defense platforms that made direct assault impossible, even for a full fleet. However, he began to notice patterns in the security arrangements that suggested potential weaknesses for a small infiltration team. Lisa Rodriguez found him in the intelligence center at 3 a.m, staring at holographic displays that showed guard rotations and patrol schedules with an intensity that worried her. She had served with Jake long enough to recognize the expression he wore when planning operations that defied military logic and common sense. His most successful missions had always been the ones that other officers declared impossible before he proved them wrong. The prototype stealth ship sat in the experimental bay of Admiral Carter's flagship, like a promise of possibilities that conventional military thinking could not imagine. The vessel represented cutting-edge human technology that combined traditional engineering with innovations copied from alien designs encountered during previous conflicts. Jake had studied its capabilities during his recovery time after New Haven and recognized that it might be the key to reaching the processing station undetected. He assembled his team carefully from volunteers who had served with him during the colonial defense and understood his approach to tactical problems. Lisa Rodriguez agreed to handle communications and electronic warfare, while 3 Marines named Peter Walsh, Tony Stevens, and Gary Cooper provided the combat skills necessary for a mission deep inside enemy territory. Each team member knew they were volunteering for what amounted to a suicide mission with almost no chance of success or survival. The theft of the stealth ship required precise timing and careful planning, since Admiral Carter had specifically forbidden any rescue attempts. Jake used his clearance codes to access the experimental bay during a shift change, when security was lightest, and managed to launch the vessel before anyone realized what was happening. By the time Fleet Command discovered the theft, they were already in hyperspace, heading toward Vorthic territory. The journey to the processing station took 4 days, during which Jake refined their infiltration plan using intelligence data that Lisa had managed to copy from fleet databases. The facility was larger than most space stations, with sections dedicated to different types of processing activities. Prisoners were sorted by species and intelligence value, with the most important captives held in maximum security areas near the central core. Princess Zarathi was being kept in a special section designed for high-value prisoners whose knowledge could provide strategic advantages to the Vorthic War effort. The area was protected by multiple layers of security, including biological scanners that could detect non-Vorthic life forms and neural monitoring systems that tracked the mental state of prisoners to prevent escape attempts. Getting inside would require bypassing technologies that humanity barely understood. Jake's plan relied on using the processing station's own systems against the Vorthic by introducing chaos into their normally perfect coordination. Lisa would hack into their communication networks while the Marines created diversions in different sections of the facility. The confusion would hopefully provide enough cover for Jake to reach the maximum security area and extract the princess before enemy forces could respond effectively. The stealth ship approached this processing station during what appeared to be a shift change when traffic in the area was at its heaviest. Jake watched through the viewports as they passed close enough to see the organic architecture of the facility, with its flowing curves and pulsing lights that reminded him of some vast sea creature feeding in the darkness of space. Thousands of smaller craft moved around the structure like parasites servicing their host. They docked at a maintenance bay that Lisa had identified as having minimal security coverage and began their infiltration through service corridors that connected different sections of the facility. The interior of the processing station felt alive in ways that made human skin crawl, with walls that seemed to breathe and floors that responded to footsteps with subtle changes in texture and color. Jake split his team according to plan with the Marines heading toward the industrial sections, while he and Lisa made their way toward the maximum security area where Princess Zarathy was being held. The corridors they traveled seemed designed by minds that thought in patterns completely alien to human logic, with passages that curved and twisted in ways that defied normal architecture. They encountered their first Vorthic guards near the security checkpoint that controlled access to the high-value prisoner section. Jake used tactics learned during the New Haven defense to turn the facility's own systems against the guards by overloading power conduits that created electrical storms in the confined spaces. The confusion allowed them to bypass the checkpoint without triggering general alarms that would have brought hundreds of defenders. The maximum security cells were arranged in a circular pattern around a central monitoring station where Vorthic technicians observed their prisoners through neural interfaces that provided direct access to captured minds. Jake could see Princess Zarathy through the transparent walls of her cell, where she hung suspended in some kind of biomechanical restraint system that kept her unconscious while machines probed her memories. The rescue attempt required disabling a monitoring station without alerting the rest of the facility to their presence. Lisa worked frantically to hack into the Vorthic computer systems, while Jake prepared charges that would destroy the restraint mechanisms holding the princess. Every second increased the risk of discovery as more guards could arrive at any moment. Princess Zarathy regained consciousness as the restraint system released her, and initially believed the rescue was another Vorthic trick designed to extract information through false hope. Her armor had been removed, and she appeared weak from whatever procedures the enemy had performed on her during captivity. She looked at Jake with suspicion and exhaustion that spoke of torture beyond human imagination. "Even in my dreams, humans fail to understand honor," she said weakly, as Jake helped her toward the cell exit. The escape route he had planned required them to reach the docking bay where their ship waited, but alarms were already beginning to sound throughout the facility as the Vorthic discovered the security breach. The journey back through the processing station became a running battle as enemy forces converged on their position from multiple directions. Jake used every trick he had learned during his military career to keep them moving toward safety, while Princess Zarathy recovered enough strength to help fight their pursuers. Her knowledge of Calaxian combat techniques proved valuable even without her armor. They reached the docking bay to find it, surrounded by Vorthic warriors who had anticipated their escape route and prepared an ambush that would have destroyed them completely. Jake realized that their only chance was to create enough confusion to allow the princess to escape, even if it meant sacrificing the rest of the team. He prepared to destroy their ship in a way that would take out most of the enemy forces while launching Princess Zarathy in an escape pod. His final transmission to her was simple and direct. Someone worth saving doesn't need to prove their worth. The explosion that followed. Princess Zarathy returned to her fleet, changed by experiences that no Calaxian had ever survived before. The rescue from the Vorthic processing station had shattered fundamental beliefs about honor and worthiness that had guided her people for thousands of years. She found herself studying human tactical manuals with an intensity that surprised her military advisors who had never seen their princess show interest in alien military doctrines. The concepts she discovered challenged everything the Calaxians understood about proper warfare. Humans wrote about adaptation and flexibility as if these were virtues rather than signs of weakness. Their military history was filled with victories achieved through what Calaxian culture would consider dishonorable tactics, including deception, retreat, and using enemy strengths against them. Yet these methods had allowed humanity to survive conflicts against superior forces throughout their violent history. Commander Kethmer found his princess in her private study at dawn reading reports about human military actions with her armor displaying colors he had never seen before. The shifting patterns of blue and silver suggested deep contemplation mixed with something that might have been admiration. When he asked about her interest in human warfare, she looked at him with eyes that held new understanding. "A human lieutenant understands something my people have forgotten," she said, while accessing holographic displays that showed tactical analyses of Jake's defense of New Haven. True strength comes not from rigid tradition, but from the courage to adapt when faced with extinction. We have been so focused on maintaining our honor that we forgot the purpose of fighting in the first place. Meanwhile, Jake faced court-martial proceedings aboard Admiral Carter's flagship, where military prosecutors argued that his unauthorized rescue mission had violated direct orders and endangered valuable resources. The charges were serious enough to result in imprisonment or discharge from service, but Jake seemed strangely calm as he listened to testimony about his crimes against military discipline. The proceedings changed dramatically when intelligence officers presented evidence gathered during the rescue mission that revealed crucial information about Vorthic weaknesses and operational procedures. The data Jake's team had collected provided insights into enemy command structures and tactical preferences that human forces had been unable to obtain through conventional intelligence gathering. The court-martial board found themselves weighing military discipline against strategic necessity. Lisa Rodriguez testified about the technical achievements of the mission, including successful penetration of Vorthic security systems and extraction of classified enemy information. Her evidence showed that Jake's unconventional approach had accomplished objectives that traditional military operations could never have achieved. The rescue had been illegal, but it had also provided advantages that might prove decisive in the larger war. Admiral Carter faced political pressure from Fleet Command to make an example of Jake while simultaneously recognizing the value of his tactical innovations. The war against the Vorthic Empire was going badly for both human and Calaxian forces who continued to lose battles against an enemy that seemed to understand their capabilities better than they understood themselves. New approaches were desperately needed if either species hoped to survive. The resolution came when Princess Zarathi formally requested Jake as her tactical advisor for a proposed joint operation against a major Vorthic stronghold. Her message to Human Command emphasized the strategic importance of cooperation between their species and specifically mentioned Jake's unique qualifications for integrated combat operations. The court-martial was quietly suspended while military leaders considered the implications of Calaxian cooperation. Jake found himself assigned to the Calaxian flagship as part of a cultural exchange program that was really a desperate attempt to develop effective joint tactics before the Vorthic could complete their conquest of both civilizations. The transition was difficult since human and Calaxian military cultures operated according to completely different principles that often conflicted in dangerous ways. Their first joint operation was a disaster that nearly resulted in both species declaring war on each other instead of their common enemy. Communication failures led to friendly fire incidents when Calaxian bioships responded to human electronic warfare techniques as hostile attacks. Human commanders could not understand Calaxian honor protocols, while Calaxian officers found human tactical flexibility to be evidence of cowardice or betrayal. Princess Zarathi and Jake worked together to analyze what had gone wrong and develop better integration procedures for future operations. The process required long hours of discussion about fundamental differences in how their species approached warfare and military organization. They discovered that many apparent contradictions were actually complementary strengths that could be combined into more effective fighting methods. Late one night aboard her flagship, Princess Zarathi admitted something that would have been impossible before her capture by the Vorthic. They were alone in her tactical center studying holographic displays of enemy positions when she spoke about her real reasons for rejecting human alliance proposals during their first meeting. "I called you unworthy because I feared what your methods might mean for our traditions," she said with armor that showed deep purple patterns of vulnerability and uncertainty. "But honor without effectiveness is merely elaborate suicide." My, people have been so concerned with fighting properly that we forgot about fighting successfully. Jake listened carefully as she explained how Calaxian society had developed rigid codes of conduct that preserved their identity through thousands of years of conquest and expansion. Their military traditions had served them well against enemies who shared similar concepts of honorable warfare, but proved inadequate against the Vorthik, who followed no rules except victory through any means necessary. The integration process continued with joint training exercises that taught both species to work together despite fundamental cultural differences. Human soldiers learned to coordinate with biomechanical Calaxian warriors, while Calaxian crews discovered the advantages of human technical innovation and tactical flexibility. The results were often chaotic, but gradually began to show promise. Princess Zarathi found herself changing in ways that disturbed some of her advisors who worried about alien influence on their traditional leader. Her armor displayed new color patterns that reflected exposure to human concepts, while her tactical decisions incorporated elements of adaptation and improvisation that had never been part of Calaxian military doctrine. She was becoming something new that combined the best aspects of both cultures. Jake experienced similar changes as he learned to appreciate Calaxian concepts of honor and duty that gave meaning to military service beyond simple survival. The biomechanical technology of their ships offered capabilities that human engineering could barely imagine, while their warrior traditions provided psychological strength that sustained them through impossible odds. The breakthrough came during a joint assault on a Vorthik communications relay that required perfect coordination between human stealth technology and Calaxian bioship capabilities. Jake and Princess Zarathi developed a tactical plan that used human electronic warfare to disable enemy sensors, while Calaxian living ships penetrated their defenses using organic systems that the Vorthik could not detect or counter. The mission succeeded brilliantly, with both species contributing essential elements that neither could have provided alone. Human technical skills opened the way, while Calaxian bioweapons destroyed the target with precision that conventional explosives could never have achieved. The victory demonstrated that cooperation between their civilizations could produce results that exceeded the sum of their individual capabilities. In the aftermath of this successful mission, Princess Zarathi formally proposed the creation of integrated combat units that would combine human and Calaxian personnel under joint command structures. Her request was supported by tactical analyses that showed the effectiveness of combined operations against Vorthik forces who had not yet developed counters for truly integrated alien cooperation. Jake found himself promoted to a newly created rank that had no precedent in either military tradition, but reflected his unique role as a bridge between two very different approaches to warfare. The position came with responsibilities that extended far beyond simple tactical planning to include cultural interpretation and strategic coordination between species that were still learning to trust each other. The war against the Vorthik Empire was far from over, but both humans and Calaxians had discovered something valuable in their forced cooperation. They had learned that strength could come from embracing differences rather than trying to eliminate them, and that survival sometimes required abandoning old certainties in favor of new possibilities that neither species could have imagined alone. The Vorthik Prime Nexus hung in space like a cancer made of metal and flesh that pulsed with malevolent intelligence, while coordinating the destruction of entire civilizations. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of Princess Zarathi's flagship, watching the massive biomechanical construct that served as the central nervous system for the enemy empire. Intelligence reports suggested that destroying the Nexus would cripple Vorthek forces throughout the galaxy, but reaching it would require sacrifices that neither species might survive. The joint human-Calaxian fleet, assembled for the final assault, represented everything both civilizations could spare from their desperate defensive efforts. Admiral Carter commanded the human contingent from his battleship, while Princess Zarathi led the Calaxian bioships in formations that combined traditional honor tactics with adaptive strategies, learned from months of cooperation with their alien allies. Jake and Princess Zarathi had spent weeks developing battle plans that integrated human technology with Calaxian biomechanical systems in ways that neither species had imagined possible. The strategy relied on using living Calaxian ships to infiltrate the Nexus organic defenses, while human vessels provided electronic warfare support and covering fire against conventional weapons systems. The approach to the Nexus revealed the true scale of Vorthik military power, as defensive installations that dwarfed entire planets opened fire with weapons that turned space itself into a killing field. Human ships used advanced shielding technology to protect the more vulnerable Calaxian biovessels, while the living ships employed their organic camouflage systems to avoid detection by enemy sensors. Princess Zarathi's armor displayed rapid color changes that reflected the stress of commanding a battle that would determine the fate of both their species. Her tactical displays showed enemy forces that outnumbered the joint fleet by margins that made victory seem mathematically impossible, yet she and Jake had identified weaknesses in the Nexus defenses that might allow a small force to penetrate the central core. The first phase of the assault involved human stealth ships, creating diversions in the outer defensive zones, while Calaxian biovessels approached the main structure, using organic mimicry that made them appear to be part of the Nexus itself. Lisa Rodriguez coordinated electronic warfare efforts from her position aboard the flagship while monitoring Vorthik communication networks for signs that their deception had been discovered. Jake led a boarding party that included both human Marines and Calaxian warriors, and the first truly integrated assault team either species had ever deployed. The combination of human tactical flexibility with Calaxian biomechanical capabilities created possibilities that the Vorthek had not anticipated when designing their defenses against conventional attacks. The interior of the Prime Nexus defied description as corridors that seemed alive, connected chambers filled with machinery that pulsed like organs in some vast organism. Vorthik defenders emerged from walls and floors with coordination that spoke of perfect communication with the controlling intelligence that managed every aspect of their empire from this central location. Fighting inside the Nexus required tactics that neither humans nor Calaxians had developed independently, as they faced enemies that could reshape their environment while coordinating attacks through direct neural interfaces. Jake used human explosives to create chaos in the organic systems, while Calaxian warriors employed bioenergy weapons that disrupted the living components of the enemy infrastructure. The progress toward the central core was measured in meters rather than kilometers, as every passage was defended by systems that adapted to their tactics with frightening speed. Princess Zarathi fought beside Jake with a combination of traditional Calaxian combat forms and improvised techniques that she had learned from studying human military methods during their months of cooperation. The breakthrough came when they reached a chamber that contained the primary control nodes for the Nexus communication network. Jake realized that destroying these systems would create cascading failures throughout the Vorthek Empire, while Princess Zarathi identified biomechanical components that could be disrupted by Calaxian energy weapons in ways that would amplify the damage. The final assault on the control chamber required both leaders to fight side by side against Vorthik defenders that included converted warriors from dozens of conquered species. Princess Zarathi was wounded while protecting Jake from a biomechanical creature that had once been a Calaxian ship captain before being processed by enemy technology into a weapon. "Now we are equal in scars," she gasped, while her armor showed colors that indicated both pain and satisfaction. Having proven herself worthy of the partnership they had forged through months of combat and cooperation, Jake helped her toward the central control node while responding with words that reflected everything they had learned about each other during their unlikely alliance. "We are always equal. It just took a war to prove it." The destruction of the Prime Nexus required perfect coordination between human, nuclear technology, and Calaxian bioenergy systems to create a reaction that would propagate throughout the organic components of the massive structure. Jake and Princess Zarathi worked together to program the combined weapon systems, while enemy forces converged on